Hello. Wow, I thought that was a very, very rich talk by Roberto. And I think a great way also to, I mean, not the first talk, but also to generally commence this conference. Because I feel that, he provided some really good and instructive points regarding the character of Marxist abstraction. As well as, of course, applying it to the critique of the digital, which I thought was great as well. What I would like to do now is I'm going to get a little bit more into the weeds with respect to this discourse. So Roberto was talking in the main about the link between abstract labor and processes of abstraction and how that might pertain to the digital age as per the mandate of the conference. And what I would like to talk about here a little bit more is the link with history. And in particular, a debate which has, I hesitate to say raged within Marxist circles because it, sounds perhaps a notch too dramatic, but that has been occurring within Marxist discourses. So one of the thinkers that we've drawn on, I think myself and other people here, very heavily is Alfred Sohn-Rethel. He is the one responsible for the popularization of the term real abstraction, right? And that term refers to the idea within his work that abstract thought as we know it originates within processes of commodity exchange. And he relates this to the ancient world, right? So he goes back to, ancient Greece, right? And he says if the ancient Greeks were able to conceive of a kind of unitary substance, which would later become geometry and a sort of quantitative mathematics, that this was arising because of the importance of commodity exchange within the Mediterranean Sea, right? So he looks at, in a way it's interesting, right? Because there's a materialism, but it's a materialism in a sense of the form of the commodity, right? It's the equivocation between commodities for the purposes of exchange that allows us to make the sort of equivocations that become essential to Greek, science and philosophy and so on. But there has been a very, very significant objection to this in the past few years. And that objection, I think, you find it in general within sort of the value theoretical school, but maybe the most significant mouthpiece for this has been Moishe Postone. And his basic argument is that, you cannot use resources, right, like the Marxist commodity form to explain cultural developments within ancient Greece, because the commodity form, its efficacy is exclusive to capitalism, right? And that's because it's only under capitalism that it becomes possible to exchange quantitative amounts of socially necessary labor time, right? Because that requires a capitalistic organization of the economy. So I just want to introduce that, and I'm going to go into my slideshow now. So again, as I said, this is going to be kind of into the weeds of Marxology. So I hope everyone follows and is able to do that. So this is staying with Sohn-Rethel on the embryosis of capital. So since the development of the notion of real abstraction in the 1920s, Sohn-Rethel's idée fixe, to wit, the idea that abstraction as we know it emerges historically due to commodity exchange, has attracted a fairly high quotient of derision from his Marxist theoretical peers. In 1936, Max Horkheimer attached his work as, quote, exaggeratedly idealist. Later, in 1977, Antonio Negri referred to it as, quote, old-fashioned, for its lack of consideration of the role of the working class or masses in shaping history. More recently, it has been charged by a value theoretical school, which owes a great debt to it, with anachronistically trans-historicizing the commodity form. While it only has socially definitive effects under capitalism, so the story goes, Sohn-Rethel treats it as explanatory of the developments of, for example, philosophy and mathematics in ancient Greece. So again, this being the basic fissure I was discussing. The definitive exponent of this critique is that of Moishe Postone, in the sense that he treats the value theoretical reading of Marx as the only, quote, coherent and systematically powerful one. Yet while Postone's critique of Sohn-Rethel has become a de facto rejoinder to any application of real abstraction to pre-capitalism, it contains within it two crucial faults. First, it fails to understand that the commodity form, while only fully generalized within capitalism, has social effects long before it. Second, having made this mistake, it misreads Intellectual and Manual Labor, or Sohn-Rethel's most famous book, which begins with capitalist abstractions before betraying their genesis. It would not be an exaggeration to say that, by reading the book forward, Postone ends up reading it backwards, with the result being a severe misinterpretation. So I'm going to summarize Postone's ideas a little more heavily here. In his masterwork, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, Moishe Postone takes aim at what he terms, quote, traditional Marxism, an underspecified term that runs the gamut from Lenin to Lukács to Althusser. Traditional Marxists, according to Postone, have understood Marx's work as an attempt to liberate labor from the exploitation of surplus value, often treating the former as transhistorical. That is labor, the idea that it's an eternal category. What this ignores, however, is that Marx does not begin Capital with an analysis of surplus value or labor or property. Rather, he begins by discussing the dual character of labor, that is, the division between concrete and abstract labor. Whereas concrete labor is qualitative in the sense of referring to the creation of use values, abstract labor is quantitative in the sense that it refers only to a quantum of time. However, it is crucial for Postone that we understand that abstract labor can only issue from capitalism due to the way that it contains a number of presuppositions. The one Postone focuses most on is the development of, quote, abstract time, quote, uniform, continuous, homogeneous units, empty time measured in constant temporal units. As Postone shows, this form of time, which of course we're all using right now to measure this conference, to be clear, this form of time only became pervasive with the development of capitalism in Western Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. This thesis has a couple of significant implications for Postone. First, that the category of labor valorized by Marx is entirely specific to capitalism, since it refers only to abstract labor, that is, proletarian labor performed under capitalism. Second, that actually existing socialist states were premised on a misreading of Marx, since they sought to abolish surplus value exploitation from the standpoint of abstract labor, rather than opposing themselves altogether to it, right? So the idea that if you look at the Soviet Union, for example, that they would have been against the exploitation of surplus value, but that they failed to confront the phenomena of abstract labor, right? Which is the real kind of nucleus of capitalism. Well, this reading is influenced by Sohn-Rethel, since he was crucial for the West German crisis group that inspired Postone. Where it diverges with him is in its view of the import of the commodity form for pre-capitalism. Indeed, for Sohn-Rethel, it is the crystallization of commodity exchange in the form of money beginning in 7th century BC ancient Greece that engenders the pattern or framework of nature in the abstract from which springs both philosophy and science. This is due to the way that commodity exchange is both real and abstract. Real, in the sense that it takes place in physical space, and abstract, in the sense that it involves a quantitative process of equivocation. It is thus a real abstraction. Because Postone believes that the commodity form does not meaningfully impact society prior to capitalism, he argues that Sohn-Rethel interprets the commodity form as being extrinsic to commodity-determined labor, and then attributes to production as such a role in societalization which it does not possess. This prevents him from grasping adequately the character of these alienated social structures created by labor-mediated societalization and the specificity of the process of production in capitalism. So in other words, without capitalist production, you can't have the commodity form, so then you can't have an extrapolation of metaphysics, right, or real abstraction from the commodity form. In fact, Sonrathel acknowledges this dilemma in intellectual and manual labor, but responds to it by arguing that exchange relations must have the formal ability to weave a web of social coherence among the mass of private individuals, all acting independently of one another, before, by the action of these exchange relations, their labor spent on all the multi-variety of products can be quantified proportionally to the social needs. For Postone, this conception of value before value is at odds with the thought of Marx. Yet is this true? In Capital, Marx argues that commodity exchange begins at the, quote, boundaries of primitive communities before entering into them, and is first determined by, quote, chance. He then adds, though, a few pages later that if it is declared that the social characteristics assumed by material objects, or the material characteristics assumed by the social determinations of labor on the basis of a definitive mode of production, are mere symbols, then it is also declared at the same time that these characteristics are the arbitrary product of human reflection, right? So he's cautioning here against the idea that at any point in history, you can simply say that, well, people are, the basis of exchange would be rooted in ideation. Here we have a tricky dilemma. While both Sonrathel and Marx acknowledge that exchange must have an underlying substratum prior to capitalism, because how could you, equivocate between values if there wasn't some kind of, or equivocate between goods, as the case may be, if there was no substratum. They're hesitant to attribute it unambiguously to labor due to the way that this presupposes capitalism. But this is a problem that must be attacked head on, not sidestepped by simply denying the possibility that the commodity form could conceivably influence pre-capitalist society. The ambiguous status of labor vis-a-vis, say, non-hegemonic pre-capitalist commodity exchange, in fact, stems from the absence of particular conditions that would enable production via capitalist abstract labor. So we use an example here. It's a little bit superficial, but I think it can be illustrative anyway. If we look at all oil producers in ancient Greece, producing for the purposes of exchange, let's say, they didn't exist in a capitalist market. They didn't have a socially enshrined system of abstract time with which to measure labor. They didn't have developed means of transmitting their product from one region to another. They didn't have machines that greatly evened out differences of strength amongst workers, et cetera, et cetera. Productivity thus would have been intensely localized, right? With all oil fetching far lower prices, in e.g. the Peloponnese and Crete, though we should actually not forget that this is still the case, right? If you look at petrol economies, it's not like natural resources are, cost the same in every country. It is clear that given the absence of a generalized quantum of socially necessary labor time required to produce a product such as this in the ancient world, we cannot speak of value as existing as in the same sense as within capitalism. Yet at the same time, the point of both Marx and Sonrathel is that there still exist, quote, social determinations of labor within this context. That is, that labor still plays a significant role as a mediating category. This is true even if it does not function as commodified labor power. When slave owners are paid an apophora in return for lending slaves out to produce goods for the market, for instance. One could think of this as a shift from quantity to quality. While labor was significant to price formation prior to capitalism, it is only with the pervasive commodification of labor that it becomes broadly determinate, right? So again, we do have a significance to labor, right? But it's not the substance of value in the way it would be within capitalism. Because there are too many other factors, right, within the ancient world, right, to accomplish that kind of reduction, which also becomes palpable in thought and political economy and so forth. In addition to failing to grasp the subtleties of this account of what I'm going to call proto-value, put forth by Marx and Sonrathel, Postone makes another serious mistake in his reading of Sonrathel. This is that he outright denies that the commodity form could play a role in societalization, like the one that Sonrathel attributes to it, without delving into the details of this account. For Sonrathel, in fact, most production in antiquity was done by chattel slaves who did not participate in the network of property. Furthermore, for him, the salient feature of antiquity in our context is that the social category of value is money and as capital operating solely as merchants, usurers, and predatory capital, failed to communicate its social character to labor. And I really want to stress that it's this failure that we should really be dwelling upon when we examine this. In other words, while the upper class required abstract thought in order to quantify and exchange surplus product, and we could think of the example of rope measuring to measure taxes in ancient Egypt, for example, for tribute in the book. This occurred post festum. It did not lead to the reorganization of production so as to create surplus value, which of course is a capitalist category. It's for this reason, the failure to transmit real abstraction to labor, that the sciences cultivated in ancient Greece did not become assimilated to epistemology, did not become treated as inherent features of humans in general until Kant, right? So the epistemologization of real abstraction would be a very specific feature of modernity. Because Sohnrethel begins intellectual and manual labor by relating real abstraction to the categories a priori, it is often overlooked that this relation is framed by him as explicitly modern. At the outset, Sohnrethel points out, Kant's goal was to explain how modern science was forged out of non-empirical axioms, as with, for instance, the principle of inertia, which no one has ever observed within nature, right? Yet dynamic, as opposed to static inertia, is inextricable from the development of capitalism. Just as Galilean physics makes real Euclidean geometry within three-dimensional space, capitalism makes real the exchange abstraction. While so far we've predominantly restricted ourselves to defending Sohnrethel, we might raise here a couple of questions regarding Pistone's thought more generally. One of the things Pistone argues is that abstract labor has no purchase in pre-capitalist societies, being entirely synonymous with, e.g., the measurement of labor by abstract time, in a capitalist sense. Though Pistone does not purport to provide a literalist analysis of Marx, but rather a reconstruction, it is still worth noting that there exist passages in Marx which explicitly contradict this. Take Marx's claim in the first chapter of Capital that all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense. It is in this quality of being equal or abstract human labor that it forms the value of commodities. So here we see a link established between physiology and abstract labor, right? Marx, moreover, stresses the importance of, quote, the economy of time, even within communal modes of production, striking quite a different tone than Pistone on concrete time. Quote, the planned distribution of labor time amongst the various branches of production, he writes, remains the first economic law on the basis of communal production. So that he uses the term economy of time even to describe foraging societies, right? How do we explain this? Jacques Bidet has argued that by restricting abstract labor to capitalism, the value theoretical, or quote, esoteric school, of which Pistone would be a member, quote, confuses the notions of abstraction, abstract labor, and real abstraction. Rather, he argues for a loosely evolutionary schema, according to which abstract labor can be understood as passing through three stages. We provide a version of it here in amended form. So he talks about L1, which is labor in general, would have originated as early as, of course, communal modes of production. And this relates to sequencing and economizing tasks, and the abstraction associated with the language and the ability to fix and communicate invariance. So, this is a lot of language, but really this is just, any intentional effort to sort of compress the time required to complete a task, and to sequentialize and economize time in that way, right? And, this is like, we would almost think of this as a very basic aspect of cognition and human interaction. In L2, we have market labor, right, which is embryonic within tributary modes of production, but realized fully when surplus products are exchanged. And the relation to time here, that's the measurement of time qua surplus product for the purposes of extraction and exchange. And the abstraction associated with that is real abstraction, the stage of the ontological postulation of a global substratum in philosophy and arithmetic. And I really want to stress the importance of arithmetic and its development, right, for that stage, which is characteristic of the ancient world. And in the third, we have capitalist labor, right, L3. Happens within the capitalist mode of production. In relation to time, it's the measurement of socially necessary labor time to create surplus value. And the abstraction associated is real abstraction at the stage of classical physics and the attribution of the ontological categories of L2 to epistemology, right? So the abstraction here is on one hand, right, the non-empirical developments of of modern physics, right? As well as the postulation or association of real abstraction with epistemology. One thing worth noting here is that language, or the ability to relate different things to the same linguistic genus, identifying two different trees, both as trees, for instance, is not what real abstraction can be said to furnish us with. Sonrethel points this out in Intellectual and Manual Labor when he argues that it is commodity exchange, and thus mathematics, that frees humans from the tie-up with human activity, which still defines linguistic usage. Put another way, while language can be said to imply different substances, there's only real abstraction through which a unitary, quantitative substance is posited. This can help us address a common misconception about Sonrethel's work, according to which he would, and we quote Roberto Finelli here, one of our finest living Marxists, but only to disagree with him, unfortunately, according to which Sonrethel would be responsible for attributing, quote, the universality of concepts as abstractions from the particularities of use values made possible by the development of money. There are other aspects of Poussin's work that could be questioned. His treatment of time privileges rupture at the expense of continuity, stressing the way that capitalism represents a hard break with, quote, concrete time. That is, time measured with respect to an objectival variable, such as the diurnal cycle or how long it takes to boil a potato, which defined all hitherto existing societies. So, of course, before our modern, abstract time, time fixed in, constant numerical units, right? Like if you go in the past, it wasn't like agricultures, in China several centuries ago were like, oh, it's 9 o'clock, I gotta get up for work, right? It's like, okay, it's light, right, I'm gonna work now, right? So there's a objectival variable, which that connected to. Yet this puts him in the odd position of searching for evidence to discredit any system of timekeeping that might be deemed at least quasi-abstract prior to capitalism. When he deals with the achievements of China between the 11th and 14th centuries, for instance, Susung's hydromechanical clock tower, the system of double hours, he's keen to stress these had no widespread social application. Whether that's entirely true or not, it's nevertheless interesting to note that in Ernest Mendel's account, quote, isolated elements of manufacturing capital appeared in China long before Europe, coinciding with the period in question. A similar historical insensitivity can be seen in his treatment of philosophical history. While he analogizes Descartes' treatment of primary and secondary qualities with exchange value and use value, respectively, he completely ignores the substantial antecedents to this discourse within classical Greek philosophy. So I think it's very convenient to say, like, oh, Descartes, that's just from capitalism, right? But then completely ignore, the very substantial Greek influences on Descartes in that way. In the final instance, Poussin misreads Sonrethel, as well as Marx. The consequences of this aren't merely academic. If one follows Poussin, all those who militate from the side of the category of labor, from unions to socialist states, are worse than capital itself, or the automatic subject of capital, due to the way that they mitigate against the opening up of an ever-widening gulf between the productivity of labor and value per unit of time by bringing these into greater correspondence. Yeah, we're done. We're finishing now. So to put that in a simpler sense, right? Poussin has a very negative view, right, of everything from socialist states to labor unions on the grounds that basically they're guilty of reforming capitalism, whereas it would be preferable to just let it kind of completely play out until there was a kind of messianic rupture. While Poussin's solution to this is largely reformist, favoring a, quote, guaranteed income and lauding identitarian new movements, many of his readers subscribe to ultra-left ideas, seeing in his work an endorsement of the need to spontaneously communize. But lost in all this is the fact that far from labor being obsolete, the last 50 years have, should we look beyond the West, experienced an incredible general proletarianization. Take China now, with the largest working class in history in a single nation. Thus, the challenge today is to unite the working class the world over, constructing a new international, not to pronounce it dead when it's at its zenith. I give you a final quote here that I have at the end of the essay. Man will never fly, declares Breck's bishop, after a tailor with a hand-wrought pair of wings crashed into the hard church square. This turned out to be wrong. But one should remember how flight was achieved, not by being lifted on high by the angels, nor the quote natural passage of time, but with ash wood, a chain drive, a petrol engine, all of this coarser stuff. And that is the end.